Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue on some draft coverage as we are just one day away, recording this on Tuesday. Tomorrow night is the draft. There's a lot of questions and speculation around this draft in terms of what it's actually going to provide. I think there are going to be a number of key role players that can play rotational minutes in the NBA at the next level. Now, the issue is there isn't necessarily that same level of star power potential, and it makes for a very interesting conversation when you dive into ranking these draft prospects, because how much do you want to lean in terms of safety and knowing in what you're getting in a prospect, or are you looking for a high potential home run swing? So I took into consideration a bunch of those things and put together this list here. So at number 10, I have Salon. He has been a riser through the pre-draft process in the past couple weeks. From France, he is somebody that is kind of your typical, it seems like we have in the NBA, international prospect that has a lot of potential. We know the athleticism, the frame is absolutely there, 6'8" with a 7'1" wingspan, and it's going to be interesting to see whether or not he can put it all together, because he's shown really big flashes of defensive upside, especially playing help defense. Now, there are some shortcomings in terms of one-on-one defense, but we saw an improved three-point shot from him this past year, shooting 31.6, but he's really not somebody that you can build around necessarily as an offensive centerpiece just yet. The idea is about his upside, and that in years to come he can be a two-way player. I think that somewhat reminds me a little bit maybe of a Denny Avdia of the Washington Wizards, in terms of somebody who it's going to take some time to piece together all of the offensive fundamentals and the consistency on the defensive side of the ball, but is somebody who has all of the tools to possibly put it together. So I have him coming in at number 10. Number 9, I have Dalton Knecht, one of the most fun players to watch in college basketball this past year. He is an older prospect at 23 years old. Important to consider that, especially in this year's draft, where it doesn't seem like there are going to be a ton of, perennial all-stars available on the board, you might just want to take the known quantity, and I think that's what Dalton Knecht is. Now, there are some questions in terms of whether or not his offensive game is going to be able to translate at the next level, but we saw this past year in college, he is an elite scorer with top-end athleticism that I think he's going to find a role in the league. Now, again, do I expect him to be necessarily a number one option ever? No, but I definitely think that he's going to have years ahead of him. And also, the consistent improvement through him throughout his college career to get to the point where he finally makes the jump to a Power 5 conference and with Tennessee, and he immediately took over after years of being sort of this smaller school player, is somebody that I definitely have a lot of interest in and seeing where he ends up with. There are a number of teams sort of later towards the number 10-ish pick. I mean, like if the Memphis Grizzlies went to go get him, I know they already have a number of guards. Some people sort of built like him as well. I feel like Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart kind of tie into that as well, but it would be interesting to see. Also important to note with Knecht is that I thought his defense massively improved throughout the course of the year, so I don't think that is anything to be concerned about either. Number 8, I have Devin Carter, another older prospect in this year's draft, somebody who, again, has really risen up through the pre-draft process, and he is a veteran, spent some couple years with South Carolina before coming to Providence, and he is just the epitome of a dog. He kind of reminds me of Marcus Smart, who I just mentioned in the with the Grizzlies. I see him as being somebody who is really smart with the ball in his hands, is always willing to go to work, doesn't necessarily have elite size, but can still be a force of a human. I think he's really well built too, and there is some three-point shot upside. I don't know if he necessarily has, true starting point guard potential, but another player I think is going to be in the rotation for years to come on an NBA roster. Number 7, I have Rob Dillingham of Kentucky, a freshman one-and-done prospect with the Wildcats, and I think he has a really high ceiling as a scorer, where he has at times reminded me of maybe a Cam Thomas. Now, take that with what you will, because I do think that there are some tendencies with him that need to be ironed out a little bit in terms of shot selection and the ability to sort of move the ball around a little bit more. Dillingham came off the bench along with Reed Shepherd, another freshman phenom for Kentucky, and they sort of ran their own unit together, which was really successful. And again, when Dillingham is feeling himself from the field, he can make tough shots at pretty much any level on the floor. So I think that he absolutely, has the potential to be a scoring guard in the league, but there is some defensive discipline that needs to be worked out with him. Size is a little bit of an issue as well. But in the comment section, we have Eric Rodriguez asking that the Spurs have a chance to build around Victor Wembanyama and become a formidable team next season. Dillingham is somebody that I would definitely look at if I were the Spurs. The Spurs need ball handlers. They need somebody to be able to get it into the post for Victor Wembanyama, provide some spacing. I think that Rob Dillingham being selected with the number 8 pick could be a pretty interesting prospect there. And then additionally, if he can cut down on some of those reckless tendencies, he could be somebody that could, honestly evolve into, I think that the high end with him is probably close to a Tyrese Maxey. Now, maybe that's just the Kentucky logo that sort of throws me off there, but I do see some similarities in their game. Maxey just maybe a little bit more refined. So I know that's a big ask talking about somebody who almost just made All-NBA, but Dillingham is just a fun watch, period. If you want to go and look at a prospect that has a fun highlight reel, Rob Dillingham is the way to go there. Number 6, I have Zachary Rees-Shea. Rees-Shea is a very interesting prospect here where, again, I feel like I keep saying this here, and I probably something I just got to get over. You're not talking about elite high profiles here, where I don't think that Rees-Shea is going to be, a player that you're going to build an offense around necessarily, but he has size, he has shooting, and he is pretty good in transition. Now, he's not necessarily a go-to creator necessarily. He doesn't love to create shots for himself on a regular basis, but is somebody that I feel like can sort of slide into a number of different organizations and be a really nice supplemental piece, possibly even a starter, provide a little bit of spacing from a bigger frame. So I do like what Rees-Shea can put out there. Now, again, when you're talking about somebody who is being thrown in the conversation of being the number 1 overall pick, I don't know if he's necessarily a building block like that just yet, but he is somebody who can absolutely be put into a system, I would say, and find a role for himself and provide just a presence that will make his teammates better. Number 5, I have Manas Buzelis. Spent this past year in the G League Ignite, was one of the top high school prospects when he graduated a couple years ago, and then had a little bit of a disappointing year with the Ignite in the Ignite's final season, which sort of is important to come into consideration here, between him and Ron Holland as well, who I do not have in my top 10, but both players who were, potentially seen as number 1 overall picks when they graduated high school and saw their stock dip after this past season. But Buzelis, the biggest question with him is whether or not he is going to be able to shoot consistently at the next level. In high school, he shot 43% on threes in his senior season, and then he was just 27% this past year with the Ignite in a situation where there wasn't really a primary creator, there wasn't very much spacing around him, so there were obviously issues with the team construction around him at the time then, but he seems to be confident that that was a little bit of a fluke and that it should be able to return for him. Stands at 6'8". He is at least viewing himself as a point forward. I think that's a fair label, but I do have some concerns with his decision making and whether or not he actually has a tight handle that is somebody that you can sort of have being a primary ball handler. I don't think he's going to be asked to in a year one situation, but at the same time, if you're buying into the Buzella stock, you are probably thinking that he can be a little bit more of a hands-on guy, and that's going to be a big question for him as well. But I do think that the shooting is going to come around. That is the biggest question with him, though, for sure. Number 4, I have Donovan Clingan, the national champion with the UConn Huskies in back-to-back years. He has been gaining a lot of interest in terms of being the number 1 overall pick, which is very much on the table. It's just a matter of what do you think that he is going to be able to translate to outside of being a paint protector and somebody who can score some points in a pick and roll situation. And I do think that that's what he's going to be for the most part. Now, we saw a more refined post-game offensively this past year in his sophomore season, and he seems to think that he will have an ability to space out the floor a little bit more as his career goes on. I don't necessarily have faith in that personally. I think maybe, it's hard to say because we've seen guys like Brook Lopez as well who spent years in the post eventually develop a three-point shot, but I ultimately feel like Clingan is probably just going to is what he is, and that's going to be an impactful player that a number of younger teams could benefit from having right now. If you talk about a Grizzlies or a Thunder or something along those lines, the Pelicans even probably as well, just to name a few teams that could use some size, some paint protection behind their defense. Clingan does interest me there, and I think he's going to be a pro for a number of years, but the people I have ahead of him are where I sort of lean a little bit more into the ceiling, which brings me to number 3, Reed Sheppard. I feel like I'm higher on Sheppard than a lot of other people are. He is an elite shooter, shot 52.1% from 3 in college. He does a lot of that damage in catch and shoot opportunities. Like I mentioned, he came off the bench alongside Rob Dillingham during his freshman season at Kentucky, and he's another player that I think that he could land in a number of different spots and be really impactful and could make me excited about some young cores. The two that really come to mind for me are the Spurs and the Pistons. Either one of them, I think he would be a great fit. It's interesting with him because he has obviously been coming off the bench. He isn't asked to be the number 1 guard on his team, but he's a really good decision maker and passer, so he has sort of the baseline, at least intangibles, to be a guard at the next level. The issue is he doesn't really have the reps in terms of working in isolation or putting the ball on the ground, all too much, but he's somebody that I think can sort of start as a little bit of a Derek White type role. Now, size is definitely an issue. 6'1" as opposed to White, who is 6'3", 6'4". And with Sheppard as well, you talk about the fact that he was a very talented defender in college, and especially plays a little bit of that Steph Curry type defense where it's a lot of deflections and heads up off ball defense. But when he gets to the NBA, we've seen for a number of years now the way that the NBA, especially in the playoffs, is all about hunting mismatches, and there is definitely a chance with his size that he could be looked to get picked on there. But somebody who definitely stands out to me, I'm excited to see where he ends up on, especially with a couple teams in particular. Number 2, I have Stephon Castle. Castle is somebody who there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of what he's going to be at the next level. He wants to be more of a traditional point guard. His background would be a little bit more of a combo guard / wing, but you are getting a player who is going to be, one of the best in the league eventually, possibly, in terms of perimeter defense, the grit and grind that you get with him, the drive, the motor, the intensity, all of those sort of cliches is something that Dan Hurley has been sort of speaking on with Castle for basically the entirety of since he got there at UConn, where he was dealing with some injuries at the beginning of the year. He understood five-star recruit coming in here, but the goal is about something bigger. And I think that Castle is a winning basketball player. If he is able to get a consistent shot to go and sort of get more experience as a primary guy, where he was playing alongside Tristan Newton in college, who was phenomenal, I think the Castle could be a potential, building block guy on an NBA roster. And then the final name I have here at number 1 is Alex Sarr. He's, for the most part, the consensus number 1 draft prospect with a lot of the NBA teams. Definitely raw and definitely has some bust potential in terms of what if he isn't able to fully round out his game. But I have him at number 1 because if there were ever to be a player that potentially makes a massive jump, I think that Alex Sarr is the leading contender in terms of that position. A 7-footer who seems to be confident in his ability to shoot from the perimeter. Now, consistency hasn't necessarily been there yet, but he is a good mid-range shooter, so the building blocks are already there. He has really nice intensity on the defensive side of the ball and is able to, for the most part, hold up on the perimeter as a big man, which when you talk about where the game is evolving, that's where I think a Reed Shepherd or an Alex Sarr are going to be able to find a role, because they're both things that teams are looking for currently. A big man who can hold his own on the perimeter and can potentially space is just about everything you're looking for. He does need to maybe bulk up a little bit more in terms of his post defense. Not sure if he will. I think that it's very, very possible that he sort of ends up in a similar developmental path as a Chet Holmgren. Now, Chet was much more refined coming into the league than Sarr was and had more experience of being a little bit more of a, both 7-footers here, but that, point center, if you even want to call it, in terms of, having the decision making in his hands. So I'm not saying he's going to be Chet Holmgren, but just falling into a position where he's a little bit of a secondary big as he continues to round out his game. I think Sarr is a very interesting prospect here and is probably one of the most volatile in terms of what people's perceptions on them are, but going to be really interesting to see how this all shakes out. Sarr, as things currently stand, one of the favorites to go first overall, but the fact that he has been dodging the Atlanta Hawks a little bit makes that an interesting conversation. But we will be sure to keep you all updated on that. But for now, we have to take our next break, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the Toronto Raptors giving Scotty Barnes his max contract extension coming off of his rookie deal following a season in which he made his first All-Star game. So we're going to be diving into all of that. Stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.